everyone, this is Robert Sheldon, and I'd like to thank Alfred Music and Make Music for inviting me to present this session for you today, which is entitled Teach Your Students to Compose Themselves. I guess the title could have benefited from a strategically placed comma, but the title's kind of more fun without it, I think. If you have any questions about the content and you'd like to contact me, you're certainly welcome to do so. You can either do it through the contact button on my website, or you can just email me at rs@robertsheldonmusic.com. First of all, you're going to want to access the handouts. So in order to do that, go to my website, robertsheldonmusic.com, and from the home page, if you scroll down to the second section, you're going to see a button there to access clinic handouts, and from there you click that button. It'll take you to a variety of clinic topics. Just scroll down till you get to this particular one. Click on the red title, which is the link to the handouts, and you can print them and use them as you wish. I have always enjoyed composing music. My first pieces were probably around, I'm going to say age 12. I started writing for piano first, and then for small ensembles, and later for jazz band, because there were fewer parts to write out than a concert band. And then my first all-state experience in Florida, which was in my junior year, was so inspiring to me that it kind of forced me to write my first band piece, and I've just been writing ever since, and it's been a wonderful part of my life, something I've really enjoyed. And it's something I think that you and your students would enjoy too. Not everyone's going to achieve the same level of success with every piece, but it's a very satisfying thing to do, and I encourage you to try it and also to help teach your students. I've always written arrangements for my students, so over 28 years of teaching high school and university level, I've done a lot of arranging for my students, especially for marching band and things like that, where they had specific tunes that they thought would be really fun to play. My bands also played, and orchestras also played a number of my published pieces, and also pieces that were in manuscript before they were published. And since the students were seeing that, they were interested in the idea of learning to do this themselves. So part of my yearly rehearsal schedule was to help teach basic arranging skills to my students. And many of those high school students went on to arrange and then later compose some really excellent pieces. Later in my career, I taught composition at Bradley University, and my position as editor at Alfred Music required me to provide a lot of input to the composers that I was working with as I was editing their music. So I've had a fair amount of experience in this particular area, especially with over 300 published pieces at this point. So I'm happy to share with you some thoughts on this. You know, performance is largely, if you think about it, a recreation of something. But the creation of music itself is something that a lot of musicians can do, but are often afraid of trying it, or they don't quite know how to get started. So what I'm going to do today is to give you some ideas, some thoughts, ways to be able to help your students get involved with composition. And if you have the handout available, I'm going to be using the handout and just enhancing the information on that handout with some discussion. So first of all, number one, where to begin? And I think the first question to be asked is, what does the composer want to say? Because if you don't have anything to say, why are you trying to write it down? You have to have an idea, and you have to have a pretty clear idea of what you want to communicate. Next thing, what sounds can best accomplish the portrayal of the message behind the composition? And knowing the answer to this question will help save the composer a lot of time. They need to know what type of ensemble, what style, what genre, and then you can get started writing the piece. Now, in your position as a teacher, you're probably going to be starting this process as a group lesson. And you can do this, and it can be an effective method of getting students started. And I'll give you some ideas and techniques about how to do that. Individual lessons are also going to be something that's important as students make progress, because when they begin to really write more, every note, every mark on the page really needs to be analyzed. But we'll get to that also. So let's talk about group lessons. What I have found is as a class, as a large group, you can begin the process by talking about planning on how you're going to write a piece of music, just the actual plan itself. What is the overall picture of the piece? What is it that you want to say? And then the next thing is to develop the message and the mood and the form of the piece. So what type of piece and ensemble can best communicate your message? And in some cases with a large group, especially younger students, aleatoric music using non-traditional sounds or instruments can actually be a really good way to get students thinking in terms of sound, form, and expression without having to worry about notation, because that's the roadblock, is the notation issue. When the students have to be thinking about writing rhythms and they're maybe transposing and they're worried about, chord progressions and this kind of stuff, that can really inhibit their creativity. So maybe doing it without any of those challenges can at least open their minds to the creative process. So what I like to do is to ask the students to come up with an idea. What do you want to write about? Maybe get a few ideas and draw one out of a box or whatever you want to do to say, here's what we're going to do today. For instance, for today's purposes, we're going to write as a class music depicting a thunderstorm in the rainforest. Okay, so where are rainforests, and how do you want to set this up? What's going to be the way we introduce the piece to the audience? So you can discuss this with the students, like what kinds of sounds would you hear in a rainforest? Of course, they're going to say, well, bird sounds, animal sounds, and that's where you want to start, is can you do those sounds? Maybe wind sounds, and have them start doing those. Now, you want to go up to the board and write down, forest sounds, so that you can point to that later, and then the students will remember what to do. And then the next thing, maybe the rain begins. Now, as a composer, as an arranger, obviously we all draw on ideas that great composers before us have done. So if you're going to steal from the best. So let's go to Eric Whitacre, and we'll go ahead and say, raindrops, everybody start the finger snapping process slow, and then speeding it up. Maybe start in one place and go across the room until all the raindrops are coming in. And then heavier raindrops where you slap your legs, and make the heavier rain sounds. Now, of course, we're going to need a thunderstorm, so that's going to require you to cue thunder. And what are you going to do to get the thunder sounds? Get the kids thinking about how can we make a thunder sound. It might be dropping a stack of books on the floor. If you have choral risers jumping up and down on the choral rise. I mean, whatever you can do, you have to come up with your own thing there to be able to make good thunder sounds. And then, of course, as the rain passes, the thunder stops. We go back to the finger snaps, and then the storm ends in silence. Or if you want to, you can end with the wind and bird and animal sounds again, how you want to do that. Now, by doing this, you now have written the piece with the students, that their ideas are incorporated, and now you can perform it by just going up to the board and you point to letter A, that's the opening sounds, wind, bird, and then B, the raindrops, and then C, the heavier raindrops, and D, the thunder sounds, and E, the rain passes, and F, the end of the storm. So you have these things, and the students can actually do them. You can even perform it for an audience if you'd like to, just to kind of give the audience an idea about writing music as well. But here again, the notation is not music notation, it's just information for the students, and you can still teach a lot of music through this. For instance, we can teach about form. It ends the same way it begins, so it's kind of an arch form. And even with the raindrops being towards the outer perimeters of the piece, it becomes sort of an ABC BA type of piece. You can talk about those and how other music might relate to that. So there's some really good points in that to be able to teach. Now, transposition, when you start getting into actual notation, and we're going to talk largely about band in this one, no matter what you're doing, unless it's just for one instrument or for piano or something, there's going to be some transposition involved. I'm going to talk about band because it's the most complicated one. Obviously, even in string orchestra, you're still going to have some transposition to do, but we'll discuss this in terms of band because it's the most complex, and I have a transposition chart that I'm going to share with you at the end of this session, and I'll explain how that works. Now, orchestrating a chorale. This is something I did every year of my teaching. Usually did it with my top ensemble in band and in strings. And what I would do is I would find chorales, a hymnal kind of thing, and I would give each student a different hymn or chorale. And I would tell them, you only need to do the first 8 measures. Don't panic about this. Just the first or the last 8. Pick 8 measures, either the first or last are probably the best ones to do. And if you want to do the whole thing, you can, but at least 8 measures. And now we're going to orchestrate this 3 different ways. And again, I'm going to talk about doing it with band right now. So with the band students, what I would do is I'd say, first of all, let's just do it within your section. And the sections I would pick would be flute, oboe, bassoon, clarinet, bass clarinet, sax section, horns, and then maybe trumpets, and then low brass, and percussion could even do it on, mallets and timpani. So there's a way to be able to do that. And I would have them do it with just that group because it's who they're most familiar with. It's a little easier. And you can also send them off in the corners of the room and they can try it out. So that's the first way. The second way I'd have them orchestrated is with a full band, but what I would do is say, let's take each instrument and place it in one category, soprano or alto or tenor or bass. And now it's just going to be one clarinet part, one flute part, one trumpet. How every instrument would have just one, but you would still do the SATB. And then the final way that we would do it would they would expand that out. So there might be 3 trumpets, 3 clarinets. You would have a full instrumentation with it. And when we got to that point, I would also, of course, want the students to conduct their arrangement or their orchestration with the ensemble as well. So this gives the kids a lot of ideas about how to voice what they're trying to actually write. And again, it's not original, but the skills that they're learning are translatable to their own personal compositions later on. Now, I don't allow any computer to be used at this point. It's all pencil and paper score and parts. And the reason for that is when the students spend their time actually physically notating, writing in pencil and paper these notes and rests, quarter rests, can you imagine? But when they have a chance to do this and articulation, whatever else they're doing, when they go back to performing on their instrument, they are far more attentive to those details in the written music that they're playing when they have been, rather than say forced, I'll say allowed, encouraged to write them all themselves. It's just something that they pay more attention to. So I think it's kind of important to do. Now, once they've orchestrated or arranged, now you'll find that they're generally going to be successful with this too. That's the other thing. It's not a 100% success rate, but it's pretty close. With a little monitoring on your part, they're going to all be successful. Now they're going to be less afraid to compose. So let's talk about composing. Now, for me, my first composition teacher was Clifton Williams. Yeah, I know, that's crazy, but that's part of the reason I went to University of Miami was to study with him. He was kind of my surrogate dad. My father had passed away my first week of college, my freshman year, and he kind of filled in that role for me. So I have wonderful memories of Dr. Williams. And he had his students do a couple of exercises, musical exercises, that I'm going to share with you. One he called his 5-finger melodies, and the second he called his 5-note clusters times 3. Let me explain. So, first thing to do is to develop a list of moods, and it could be anything from, happy, sad, anxious, amorous, to, resolute, apprehensive, bored, angry, whatever you can come up with. But you need to have this list that you would create. Then the next thing you would do is you would create melodies and clusters to represent those moods. Now, in the 5-finger melody, it was just 5 notes, and they could be any notes that you wanted to play, just 5 of them that had to represent and depict that mood or that feeling. And then when it came to the clusters, they were 5-note clusters, not, I mean, they could be triads if you wanted to, but they weren't necessarily chords, but they were 5 clusters of notes that, again, the combination of the 3 sets of those 5 notes were supposed to represent the mood. And the true, I guess you would call it, evaluation of whether or not you were successful is if you could play them and others could say, oh, that's that mood, and they could pick the right mood. So if you could do that, that was really a success. Even a better way of doing it is to have somebody else play them so that you weren't kind of giving it away body language wise. Just have someone else play it and see if they could figure out what the mood was. But it's a great way to kind of break you out of traditional thinking in terms of being able to come up with ideas to how to write music. Now, how do you get less experienced students with little or no theory background, which is going to be the case for many of you, to start writing? So I have a few teaching methods and handouts that I'm going to show you that are taken actually from Sound Innovations for Band and the method book for beginning band, and also from the enrichment pages that are available free online. And I'll show you those in just a moment. First way is to write, and you can write as many of these as you would like to. You just write a melody and you omit notes here and there. Or you write a melody and you omit a measure. And then what the students have to do is to fill in the missing notes or the missing measure. So they just have little bite-sized nuggets of composition, of original ideas here, rather than just starting from a blank slate and having to write something. Another way to be able to help students with their writing is to tell them if there's an interesting rhythm or an interesting melodic fragment that you've written, you need to repeat those rhythms or those fragments to be able to create more interest and cohesion and strength of the piece. Another thing to do is to improvise melodies, just play them, and you could trade measures with students. Like you could play a 4-beat measure, and then they would answer you with another 4-beat measure of their own thing that they would like to play. But here again, it's just a matter of kind of getting students to think about melodic shapes and ideas, and also the idea of question and answer, which is a really important feature in writing a piece of music. Or we call it antecedent and consequent phrases, which promotes the musical conversation. So I'm going to play a question for you, and you're going to answer it with an musical answer for me. And you can also experiment with changing textures and thematic variations. And then if you can write a full phrase of an A melody or an A theme, and then write a contrasting B theme, now you can create an ABA form, or maybe A prime BA. And here again, I'll show you some ideas about this in a few moments when we go over some of those musical handouts. Now, keeping it relevant, it's really important for the students to write a piece so it can be played immediately. And that means either just on piano or with a small ensemble. Remembering that the smaller the number of players involved, the easier it is to rehearse. So if you're writing for a duet, it might be very easy to get you and another player together and try it out, and you'll know right away whether it's something that works. But if you've written something that requires an ensemble that is capable of playing Carmina Burana, you may never get to hear what it sounds like. So keep it smaller, keep it relevant. Keep it short, because at this stage, it's something that really needs to be played with virtually no rehearsal required, because you're going to have a hard time finding an ensemble or group of players who has the time to rehearse. So sometimes if it's a longer piece, it's a good idea just to play the first part of a piece to be sure you're on the right track. Then comes the procedure. So students have a tendency to wander musically as they compose. So having a plan of action will help keep them focused so they don't waste time, or in some cases paint themselves into a musical corner that's really difficult to get out of. So here's what I do, and I know some people would say that musically I'm very ADD or OCD, maybe just ODD. But anyway, here's what I do when I write. I plan a piece as if I was going on a vacation. If I'm going on a vacation, I want to know, where am I going? How long am I going to be gone? Who's going to go with me? What do I plan to see while I'm there? And am I coming home, or am I just going to stay there forever? I mean, those are kind of important things. Is it a one-way trip or round trip? So those are the things I think about, along with other things like, how much is it going to cost? But we won't get into all of that. Do I need a passport? We're not going to get into that. But from the standpoint of planning, those are the things that I think about. This forces students, if they think about it in this way, to help them decide the meaning behind the piece. The meaning behind the piece is, where are you going? Or maybe, why are you going there, right? It helps them to decide the instrumentation, which is the question, who's going with you? That's your instrumentation. It helps them decide the form. What do you intend to do on the trip? What are all your side excursions you're going to do? Or what do you plan to see? And are you coming home? Because here again, if you're coming home, you need to leave, in your trip, you need to leave time to get home before you have to report back to work, right? You have to plan some time to get home. In a piece of music, you need to plan the time to get home also. Otherwise, the piece might be really, really longer than you want it to be. So you have to kind of plan for that. And then, of course, the duration of the piece, which is how long is your trip. So these are all things that I share with my students, and it helps get them think about the process in a more literal and maybe personal way. Now, point number 6, sharing and caring. Make the piece playable, and that means the key, the rhythm, the range, and the technique needs to be reasonable. Students have a tendency to write the most challenging, difficult thing they can because they think it makes them a better composer. I used to be like that. Thank goodness for Richard Bowles, who took me under his guidance and said, I think you can write, but everything you're writing right now are things that no one can play. If you can write something that someone can play, I think you may have a chance to be a successful composer. Thank you, Mr. Bowles. I really appreciate that when I was studying with him, getting my master's at the University of Florida. So keep it playable. Focus on sound and expression rather than difficulty. Using pencil and paper or computer. Now, this is a choice at this point that you can make with your students. As we discussed, writing pencil and paper tends to reduce repetition, which is the cut and paste that happens when students use computer. And also, when you're using a computer, younger students, they can write unrealistically and irrationally difficult music that can easily be computer notated, but that's virtually unplayable. So by writing it pencil and paper, it alleviates that. So it's something to consider. And you also want to be aware of the allure of cut and paste, because music can become, with computer, few clicks on the computer can make a piece ridiculously long and unreasonably repetitive. So just a few things to look out for. So now let's talk about helping the composer with their craftsmanship. You would think if you're going to write music, it's because you're feeling something or thinking something that's somewhat profound, at least important to you. Yet expressive markings are usually what young composers forget to include. For instance, check the music. Is the tempo indicated? Is there a style or an expression marking? Very often, those are the first things that the younger students tend to omit. Now, I personally like to use standard metronome markings because they look and feel right to me. In other words, 108, 112, 110 is not a metronome marking. I know on a digital metronome you can make it anything, but if it was good enough for Bach, I'm okay with it too. Now, most computer notation programs default to quarter note equals 100 beats per minute. And consequently, that's the tempo that most student compositions are. They just use the default. 100, they don't bother to reset it. Something to kind of look out for. Now, check the dynamics, the articulation. Are the markings clear? Are they consistent? Are they appropriate? Thinking about dynamics, what is the destination of a dynamic? For instance, let's say you have mezzo forte and a crescendo. Where does the crescendo go? It should go at least to forte, right? If not more. But if it's a mezzo forte and a crescendo and the next marking's piano, that doesn't make sense. So be thinking about the destination dynamic. If you're crescendoing from one level to the next, it needs to be a higher level, or decrescendoing down to a lower level. Also, look at similar passages in the music. Are they notated the same way, maybe with articulations or rhythms? Because if they're not, are they supposed to be different? If you look at one indication of the melody and it's all staccato, but the next one doesn't have that marking, or maybe the first one's slurred and the next one is not, is it purposefully not? Because if it's purposefully so, you may need to actually mark the next one so that the player is aware that it's really supposed to be different. So think about those things. Consistency is important, and if it's supposed to be different, make sure the player really understands that that's supposed to be that way. Color is created by using instrument combinations and rests. So rests are your friend. Don't be afraid to provide some rests. Rest opportunities for instrument combinations, and also color, and also rest to avoid fatigue if it's a longer piece. I mean, I can remember during my years of being editor at Alfred Music with a professional, very successful composer, and having to tell him, your clarinets have been playing for 200 measures and they haven't had a rest yet. And these trumpets have been playing above the staff for nearly a minute, all of them. Are you really sure? So you just have to remind composers, even professional ones, that they need to kind of analyze those things too. Percussion instrumentation. Do you have the personnel and the percussion instruments so that the requirements of the piece can be fulfilled? Are they reasonable requirements? You don't want to be asking for instruments that nobody has, or that you have to pay a lot of money to get just so that they can play your piece. If you do that, you need to supply some alternatives for that, because that's just unreasonable. And I've seen pieces that look like they require maybe 5 percussionists, but on one measure you need 14 players. Be thinking about that when you're looking at these pieces that your students are writing. Reasonable expectations are a good idea. And now passing tones, are they interfering with the harmony? And, just because a piece is moving fairly fast doesn't mean that you're not going to really hear those little problems. They're not so little sometimes. One of the things that often happens is if a student is writing at a piano, they're playing the parts at the piano, and they play a chord and then they do other things. When they just play the chord and it may be a whole note, the sound tends to dissipate, and they aren't always aware of the things they're playing against that chord that might be really dissonant. So you have to, if they're going to write at the piano to check what they're doing, they need to continually re-sound the notes of that whole note or half note so that it has an immediate impact against the other notes they're playing with it. Because in a wind group, in a band, those sounds are not going to dissipate. They're going to be full force for the whole time. So be thinking about that. It's pretty important to be able to make sure things are clean and sound really the way you want them to. And technical issues, are they easily resolved? Because if a piece is too difficult to play or requires an immense amount of time working out parts, chances are the piece is going to be less successful. Remind your students that a piece does not need to be a blizzard of notes in order to be good music. Also check the key signature, because very often students will get started in one key and within a short period of time they've gone to another key and they never change the key signature. An easy way to check this is look to see how many accidentals there are, because if you're looking and there's pages of A flat accidentals, maybe they're not in the key of B flat anymore. There may be a reason to change the key signature, so be thinking about key signature as well. And then rehearsal numbers, are they in appropriate places? I personally suggest a rehearsal number at the beginning of the phrase and place them approximately 8 to 12 measures apart, depending on how your phrases work. Cause and effect is a great way to ensure logic and a musical conversation, and also promotes musical cohesion of the piece. So be thinking about musical conversations. And have your students examine published scores. Now, some of the great master composers and teachers of times past actually taught their students to write by extracting individual parts from their scores. When you think about it, it's kind of brilliant, because they had the whole score and they need to write out 10 first violin parts and 8 second violins, and they just have their students do it. So it's kind of was kind of a good deal for them. But does it really help teach composition? And in a way it really does, because when you're extracting parts from the score, you have to really get into the head of the composer and figure out, why did they write it this way? Why did they articulate it like this? Why is this here? It's the most in-depth analysis you can do, is extracting parts. I'm not telling you to necessarily do that, but I actually did that for the first time when I was in 8th grade. This will give away exactly how very old I am. When I was in 8th grade, my junior high band was playing a brand new arrangement called Highlights from Hello, Dolly. Yeah. And it was missing a first trombone part. I was playing first trombone, and my band director gave me a condensed score, which you don't see very often anymore, but a condensed score and some manuscript paper, and he said, could you just go home and write yourself the first trombone part? Well, condensed scores are a little difficult to tell exactly who has what. I mean, you can tell a little bit, but precisely it's not like a full score. But I'll tell you, I wrote myself the best first trombone part on that. But it also was so interesting for me to look at that condensed score. It really helped me understand the piece a lot better. So something to consider, just as an exercise maybe for the students. And now you get into the final product. So deadlines are important. Students must complete something. You need to be aware as a teacher that when you're writing a piece of music, it's always easier to start a piece than it is to finish it. So make sure they finish something. If you can play the piece in class, that is the very best way you can help the students get a great lesson for themselves and the ensemble. The young composer can get immediate feedback from the players, like, this is impossible to play, or it'd be better if it was this way or that way. I mean, the composer can see exactly what works and what doesn't work in real time. And of course, if the piece is good enough to be performed in a concert or recital, that's an amazingly significant musical experience for your students and also for the students' parents. So something to be able to think about for future concerts. And we're back. In order to do this, I realize you are going to have access to all of these handouts. So I'm just going to demonstrate them with a quick visual here. Kind of old school, and I can at least show you what you're looking for. So here's the first of the exercises. There's 3 of them here, and you'll notice that there are arrows that are drawn. We have 3 different melodies. The arrow indicates a place where the student comes up with an appropriate note to fill in where the arrow is. It doesn't have to be one note. It could be more than one, as long as they stay within the meter that's indicated. In most cases, students will come up with pretty much the same note all across the board. Once in a while, you'll find a student that comes up with something way off the charts, but who's to say that that's wrong, right? But you want to have them go ahead and just fill in the notes there. You'll notice that here on the bottom one, this one is a full measure that they write. So instead of just coming up with one particular note to fill in on a rest, they actually have to create the whole measure. So what we're doing is we're giving them an opportunity to compose just little bite-sized nuggets first before they start doing more than that. Now here, what I've done is I have written a melody and a bass line, and you can do your own, or you're welcome to use these if you like, but this is just kind of like a 2-part invention, just 4 measures. And I've got arrows showing where different notes go. There's just one note to fill in the right hand of piano and one note to fill in the left hand of piano. Has a quarter note there, but you wind up changing that D over there to an 8th note so that another note can come into it. And then you'll notice on the next exercise 5, there's a variety of notes, treble and bass, for you to be able to put in. So here again, we're just giving the students the ability to shape and create something from pre-existing material. Now here, what we've got is, and you have the handout so you can actually play through these and look them over, but I just wanted to kind of explain them here. So on this one, the first exercise is a melody that I've written that kind of fulfills some of the suggestions I have in the text above it there. So we have a repetition of interval and rhythm, which helps to strengthen the piece, and of course it ends on the tonic, which gives it some cohesion and finality. And in the next one over here, we've got the melody again, but now we've added a bass line. And it's the placement of the notes in the bass line which helps to define the actual rhythm of the piece, helps to keep the beat going in a cohesive way. We also have a place here where there's imitation of the melody, the rhythm, and melodic gesture here, which helps to strengthen the line. And also at the very end, we end on the tonic, which is a more satisfying conclusion for the piece. And here again, you can analyze these more on your own since you'll have access to all of these. Now, at this point, we've taken that very same melody, and now we've added some accompaniment features, some rhythmic things. And there's repetition of the rhythm, which again helps to strengthen it. We've got some counterpoint here in the accompaniment part, and there's a few other places here where we've got melody and harmonies getting out of the way of the melody. Recalling earlier rhythms over here, and just completing the chords, getting out of the way of the melody, and that way we are able to kind of complete this piece in a somewhat satisfying way. And that brings us to the very last version of this, which is the completed piece. Now, of course, in order to complete it, we have to add some things to it. So this version, as you can see, has articulation, it's got dynamics, it's got tempo, it's got style, and this actually becomes a complete piece by doing this. And of course, I've just done this for keyboard, for piano, but you can use those concepts with full band or strings or whatever your ensemble is. Now, the other handout we'll show you here, this is from right out of the Sound Innovations Book 1. And here's a way of getting kids to think about writing, just using sort of a theme and variations. So we've got hot cross buns, and they can vary it by just changing the rhythm if they want, or they can change a note if they want, but they make a variation of it, which I think we call cinnamon buns. And then down here is another excerpt from Book 1 of Sound Innovations for Band. And in this one, we have given them a four-measure phrase, a question, or an antecedent phrase, if you will. They write the answer or consequent phrase. And then once it's done, then they write the whole thing out. They put their name on it. They give it a title, and it becomes their piece, maybe their first composition, which is kind of fun. And then out of the enrichment pages for Sound Innovations, what I can show you here is each level each of the 6 levels of Sound Innovations in Book 1 has a theory composition component in the enrichment pages, which are available free online that go with the book. And they're at the bottom here, the composition ones. There's a lot of theory involved, which is appropriate for each level of the book. And here we have a little composition exercise where we've got a 4-measure phrase, and then we ask the students to go ahead and write a second phrase that goes with that. And it's actually, they're supposed to be doing it as a variation of the first phrase, which makes the assignment a little more doable. In level 2, we've got some notes that are left out, and the students, it's up to them to find what the best notes are, they think, to be able to fill it in. It's very similar to what we've already done here earlier in some of our the demonstration pages. Here we're on a 4-measure, we're on a 4-measure phrase here, and they go ahead and complete the whole thing. So that's something you've already seen. And the other ones are similar. I mean, we've got 2 measures, and then they do 2 measures and another 2 measures, and they fill in 2 measures. So the concept is the same, just bite-sized pieces of things for them to be able to do until we get to the 4-measure one, where they've got a 4-measure phrase, and they complete it by writing another 4-measure phrase. And in this level, this is an example of what we talked about with the 5-finger melodies. And we've actually done this for them here. So we've got 4 moods, and they're to write something that is to depict those moods. So we've actually included that in this book because I thought it was such a good idea. And this you may think is a little advanced, but it's a really good thought exercise, which is trying to get them to write a tone row. So they have to be able to know their chromatics for one octave and make sure that they mix up the notes and are able to write all 12 notes. And then once they've done it, they can play it as a melody, and then they can do it in retrograde by playing it backward. Again, it seems like a rather advanced concept, but in reality it's not. It's just a really good way to get them to think a little bit differently. And in terms of writing it, it's not that difficult. So it's just a good exercise for them. Now, this is the transposition sheet, and again, you'll be able to see this on the handout, but I wanted to explain how it worked. So in the very first measure here, we have 4 notes for each of the instruments. And on these notes, you'll notice the 2 in the middle are larger, the 2 on the outside are smaller. What this is the 2 notes in the middle for each instrument are good ranges for young high school, let's say. Yes, the instrument can go higher, can go lower, but for most accomplished high school players, the notes in the middle there are very doable. The notes on the outside are also doable, but they're not where you want to linger. In other words, only use those notes if you really feel like you have to, and don't write a lot of music in that range. So this kind of gives you appropriate ranges and possible ranges. And then what I've got here, I've got a scale, and you'll notice some instruments like tuba only have 1 note. It's because it's the only note really within their practical range. But the reason I've done this is a B-flat scale that is in unison. So the students can see, if they want the notes to all be in unison, what these instruments look like when they're playing. And notice the piccolo can't even play until the last few notes. Tuba can only play the first note. But again, we're talking about unison here, and that's important for the kids to be able to visualize. And then we get to the last one here. I believe this is the last one. And this is percussion mapping. And I wanted to share this with you because it's kind of important too. Now, there's a lot of ways to be able to write percussion. And you'll notice every publisher seems to have a different way of doing it. But this is pretty much as standard as I think you can get. So I wanted to share it with you. So you'll notice the snare drum is on the third space, whereas the bass drum is on the bottom space. The suspended cymbal is generally above the staff, and it's usually a diamond shape, and the crash cymbal is usually below the staff, and it's usually a diamond, or X's for quarters, eighths, and diamonds for half whole notes. And then tambourine is usually notated in standard notation, not the X's and diamonds, but it can be wherever you'd like it, as long as it doesn't interfere with something else that's playing. You want each instrument as much as possible to have its own special place to live in your music. Triangle is usually a triangular shaped note head, and again, you can decide, like usually in percussion, notes that are from the middle up, their stems go up, and middle down, the stems go down. You kind of get to decide that. Sometimes when it's more than one player, like on a percussion 2-part, you've got 2 players, it's really nice to have all the percussion 1 player, especially if they're changing instruments, have with their stems up, and percussion 2 with their stems down. Kind of put them in a place where you can do that. Mark tree, which sometimes is referred to as wind chimes, but they are actually different instruments. Wind chimes are the non-pitch directed little chimes that are made of wood or metal that hang on the corner of your house, whereas the mark tree, invented by I think it's Mark Stevens in the 60s, it actually has pitch direction, which can be notated in a variety of ways. Every publisher does it differently. You'll notice also at this there's a little tie at the end. It's called a let vibrate or let ring tie. Sometimes you'll see an LV or an LR, but the little tie is a little neater. I've always found notation-wise, the less ink there is on the page, the better. So the let ring tie takes the place of that. So if you see the direction here, it's wind chimes. Don't get wind chimes confused, or mark tree, I should say. Don't get mark tree confused with bell tree. The wind chimes are the bar chimes, and the bell tree looks like a tree. So don't get the 2 of those confused. Now, rolls normally have, as you can see, 3 slashes. But as the notes become smaller, like 8th notes only get 2 slashes because the 3rd slash is actually in the flag, and then 16th notes only get 1 slash. So 30-second notes wouldn't get any. And then, of course, because who's going to roll a 30-second note anyway? Slams and roughs are usually done as a slur, kind of like you would for grace notes on a flute or clarinet. And then you get into things like the cymbal rolls here, and they usually tie to the release so you know where to actually stop it, and if it's going to ring or not. If there's no let ring, you would dampen it. Cymbals, triangle, bass drum, timpani, bells, chimes, vibraphone, all of those instruments generally damp on the rest that follows the note unless there's a let ring tie. Toms, depending on how many you've got, 2, 3, 4, it's nice to separate them by at least a third, so either use the spaces or the lines, just so it's easier to read. Tempo blocks, same kind of thing. And then other instruments, they can really be wherever you'd like, as long as you try to not put more than one instrument on the same place. It's just less confusing for the player. So these are all some things that are in your handouts, and hopefully they will be of some help to you. Again, if you have any questions about this and I can be of assistance to you, I'm certainly happy to do that. And again, you can contact me either through my website, robertsheldonmusic.com, by clicking on the contact button and filling in the information. I'll get back to you, or just go to my email, rs@robertsheldonmusic.com, and I'm happy to be able to answer any questions you might have. I hope you found this helpful. I certainly think the best way to be able to get your students interested in writing is if you write yourselves. When the student sees their teacher do it, it's like, well, hey, they can do it, so I can do it. That's generally what happened with my students, is that they saw me writing a lot and figured, well, if he can do it, I bet I can do it too. And they were right, they could. You don't have to write a symphony for whatever ensemble you're conducting. Write warm-up exercises, write chorales, or do simple arrangements at first if you're not used to doing this kind of thing. I think you'll find it to be very satisfying and exciting to be able to bring something like that. It's your personal gift you can bring to the students, and they will appreciate it, and it might also help get them interested in writing. So I hope you found this helpful. Best of luck to you. Thanks again to Alfred Music and Make Music for inviting me to do this, and see you down the road.